Welcome to the Raul Effect, where we uncover the hidden psychology behind human behavior, relationships, and emotional connection to help you see what most people never do. What if the moment you believed someone was losing interest was actually the moment their feelings became too intense to handle? What if the distance that's making you panic isn't rejection at all, but an emotional response driven by fear and vulnerability? Stay with me, because once you understand the hidden psychology behind emotional withdrawal, you'll never look at silence, space, or mixed signals the same way again. Have you ever noticed how someone who once felt emotionally close can suddenly seem distant, even though nothing obvious has happened? One day the connection feels effortless, and the next, something feels different. Their replies become slower, their enthusiasm fades, and the warmth you once felt starts disappearing little by little. Before you even understand what's happening, the relationship begins to feel uncertain. At first, you tell yourself not to make a big deal out of it. Maybe they're exhausted. Maybe work or life has been overwhelming. Maybe they just need a little space. But deep inside, your instincts recognize the change long before your mind can explain it. That's when the questions start taking over. Did I do something wrong? Have I become too available? Are they losing interest in me? Those thoughts rarely arrive without fear. When someone important to us changes their behavior, our mind automatically prepares for the possibility of rejection. It's simply how we're built. The moment uncertainty enters a relationship, the brain rushes to fill in the missing pieces. Unfortunately, fear doesn't look for the most accurate explanation. It searches for the worst one. Silence begins to feel like abandonment. Emotional distance feels like proof that love is fading. Without realizing it, you begin changing too. You become more careful, more guarded, not because you want to disconnect, but because you're trying to protect yourself from getting hurt first. But what if your interpretation is completely wrong? What if their distance isn't a sign that their feelings are disappearing? What if it's happening because those feelings have become stronger than they know how to handle? This is where so many people misunderstand emotional behavior. Not everyone responds to closeness by moving closer. For some people, deep emotional attachment creates fear instead of comfort. Instead of leaning in, they instinctively step back. They become quieter, create space, and temporarily withdraw. From the outside, it looks exactly like they're losing interest. It feels as though they're slowly removing you from their life. Yet inside, something entirely different may be happening. They may be wrestling with emotional pressure, confusion, vulnerability, and fear all at once. Part of them wants the connection, while another part is terrified of what that connection could mean. It's an internal battle between what they genuinely feel and what they're afraid to experience. This is the moment that often determines whether a relationship grows stronger or falls apart. Most people don't respond with understanding. They react from emotion. They panic, search desperately for reassurance, overthink every small interaction, or shut down completely to avoid getting hurt. Some begin matching the other person's distance. Others walk away before they believe they can be abandoned. Without realizing it, they turn a temporary emotional struggle into a permanent ending. That doesn't happen because the relationship lacked meaning. It happens because both people misunderstood what was really happening beneath the surface. This isn't weakness, it's human nature. Whenever uncertainty enters a relationship, people usually react in one of two ways. They either chase reassurance with even greater intensity, or they run emotionally before rejection has the chance to happen. When fear controls either response, the outcome is often the same: disconnection. Imagine standing in a place where you honestly don't know what someone else is feeling. Their silence becomes impossible to read. Their distance leaves you confused. You can't tell if they're slowly letting go or simply overwhelmed by emotions they don't know how to express. In that uncertainty, walking away can feel like the safest choice. It can feel like protecting your self-respect and avoiding future pain. But what if that decision is based on a misunderstanding? What if you aren't walking away from rejection at all? What if you're leaving just as the relationship is becoming emotionally real? That's why awareness is so important. Not every form of emotional distance carries the same meaning. Sometimes it's genuine detachment. Sometimes it's confusion. And sometimes it's the result of feelings becoming so deep that a person no longer knows how to manage them. If you can't recognize the difference, you'll often respond in ways that push the connection further apart. And sometimes, that misunderstanding costs you something genuine before it ever has the opportunity to fully grow. So, before assuming the worst, before allowing fear to dictate your next move, pause and consider what may actually be happening beneath the behavior you're seeing. What appears to be someone pulling away may not be a lack of love at all. It could simply be someone struggling to handle the intensity of feelings that have become far deeper than they ever expected. Sometimes a person creates distance not because they're ready to leave, but because their emotions are moving faster than they know how to handle. If you don't recognize that difference, it's easy to mistake a temporary pause for rejection. But once you see what's really happening, your entire perspective shifts. You stop reacting from panic, your thinking becomes calmer, and situations that once felt confusing begin to make sense. That's the power of clarity. It helps you look beyond surface behavior instead of assuming every bit of emotional distance means the relationship is ending. Beneath that withdrawal, there is often a pattern that most people never notice. In certain relationships, a quiet change begins to happen inside someone. Nothing obvious appears on the outside, but internally their emotions start becoming stronger than their ability to process them. From where you're standing, they may seem uncertain, inconsistent, or hesitant. Inside them, however, a much deeper emotional struggle may be taking place. At first, everything feels easy. Conversations flow naturally. Being together feels comfortable, and the connection develops without effort. Then, almost without warning, something changes. Not because of an argument or a mistake, but because the relationship starts feeling genuinely important. That's often where the internal conflict begins. They begin thinking about the connection in a completely different way. Questions surface that weren't there before. They wonder how emotionally invested they're becoming, how vulnerable they're allowing themselves to be, and what might happen if they lose control over those feelings. Instead of moving closer, they instinctively slow down. It isn't because they don't care. It's because caring has suddenly started to feel risky. This is something many people overlook. For certain individuals, closeness doesn't only create safety, it also awakens fear. Not traumatic fear that everyone can see, but a quiet psychological response that influences their behavior without them fully realizing it. They may fear becoming emotionally dependent, losing their sense of independence, or exposing parts of themselves they have spent years protecting. As their feelings deepen, caution replaces excitement. They begin overthinking every interaction. They question their own emotions and create emotional space before everything becomes too overwhelming. Most of the time, this isn't a conscious choice. It's an automatic response shaped by old emotional habits. That's where misunderstandings begin. You see their distance and assume they're losing interest. Meanwhile, your search for reassurance may feel overwhelming to them. You move closer looking for certainty, while they step back searching for emotional balance. Slowly, both people drift in opposite directions, even though the connection itself may still be deeply meaningful. That inner conflict becomes exhausting, because part of them genuinely wants to stay close. They feel the comfort, the trust, and the growing importance of the relationship. They know the bond is real. But another part of them reacts as if emotional closeness itself is a threat. The problem isn't you. The problem is what vulnerability represents to them. For someone who has spent years protecting themselves emotionally, becoming attached can feel frightening. Vulnerability isn't something they naturally embrace. It's something they've learned to avoid. As a result, they often slow everything down. Their energy becomes different. They express less emotion and create more space so they can regain a sense of control. From your point of view, it looks like the relationship is fading. From theirs, they're simply trying to manage emotions that suddenly feel much bigger than they expected. This is the emotional misunderstanding that catches so many people off guard. It usually isn't a calculated decision to push someone away. The reaction comes from emotional patterns that existed long before you entered their life. Past experiences, old fears, learned coping strategies, and years of emotional conditioning all influence how they respond. That's why even they may struggle to explain their own behavior. They simply know that something inside feels overwhelmed. Their emotions seem to be moving too quickly, and their instincts tell them to create space before those feelings become too intense. Unfortunately, this is where many people make the biggest mistake. They take the distance personally. They assume the withdrawal says something about their own worth. They convince themselves they're not attractive enough, interesting enough, or emotionally enough. They replay every conversation, searching for mistakes that probably never existed. And driven by that fear, they almost always respond in one of two ways. When fear takes over, people usually react in one of two ways. They either chase the other person for reassurance and try even harder to restore the closeness, or they shut down emotionally to avoid being hurt. The problem is that both responses often increase the very pressure that caused the other person to step back in the first place. Instead of bringing the relationship back into balance, they unintentionally widen the emotional distance. Everything begins to change when you understand what's happening beneath the surface. Instead of instantly seeing their behavior as rejection, you start recognizing it as emotional self-protection. Their need for space may simply be a way of catching their breath emotionally, not a decision to remove you from their life forever. Of course, this doesn't mean every distant person secretly wants a deeper relationship, and it doesn't guarantee every connection will work out. What it does mean is that distance isn't always proof that feelings have disappeared. Sometimes people pull back because their emotions have become stronger than they know how to manage. They hesitate, pause, and create space because they're trying to regulate emotions that suddenly feel overwhelming. If you don't understand this stage, you'll almost always misread it. Silence starts looking like emotional absence. Hesitation feels like indifference. Space becomes proof that everything is over. Yet in many cases, this is actually the moment when emotions are becoming more real, not less. How you interpret that moment can completely influence what happens next. There's another important truth beneath all of this. Emotional withdrawal rarely happens for no reason. It usually appears under very specific emotional conditions. Once you recognize those patterns, you begin seeing the situation from a completely different perspective. Ironically, the moments that confuse you the most may be the moments carrying the greatest emotional weight for them. On the outside, they seem distant, inconsistent, or detached. But internally, they may be dealing with emotions they don't know how to process. Most people judge relationships only by visible behavior. They forget that internal emotional experiences don't always match external actions. Someone rarely feels deep inner conflict over a person who means nothing to them. When there is no attachment, there is usually no confusion, no emotional resistance, and no need to create distance. Everything remains simple. That's why inconsistency doesn't always mean feelings are fading. Sometimes it means those feelings have grown powerful enough to push someone outside their emotional comfort zone. This is the part many people never see. They assume distance equals disinterest. Inconsistency means love is gone, and silence proves emotions no longer exist. But emotions don't always reveal themselves in obvious ways, especially for people who struggle with vulnerability. For some individuals, genuine emotional closeness creates two competing experiences at once. One side of them feels deeply drawn to the relationship. They recognize the comfort, the trust, and the sense that this connection is different from anything they've experienced before. At the same time, another part of them becomes afraid. Thoughts begin to appear. This is getting too intense. What if I get hurt? What if I lose emotional control? Because of that inner conflict, they slow everything down before the relationship reaches a level of intimacy they aren't ready to handle. From your perspective, their behavior feels confusing. One day they're fully engaged, the next they're difficult to read. One moment they seem emotionally present, the next they appear distant. Mixed signals naturally create uncertainty. But what you're often witnessing isn't the absence of feelings. It's someone trying to understand emotions that feel unfamiliar and overwhelming. Real emotional connection requires openness, trust, uncertainty, and the willingness to let your guard down. For someone who spent years protecting themselves emotionally, that process isn't easy. Instead of moving closer naturally, they pause. They need time to think, reflect, and make sense of what they're feeling before allowing themselves to go deeper. That doesn't automatically mean the relationship is weak. In many situations, it means the connection has become meaningful enough to trigger emotional defenses that existed long before you came into their life. That's why every period of distance shouldn't immediately convince you to walk away. When someone truly feels nothing, there usually isn't an internal struggle. There's no confusion, no emotional tension, and no need to step back to process anything. But when genuine feelings are involved, emotions rarely move in a straight line. They rise, fall, pause, and sometimes retreat before moving forward again. When you only focus on what you can see, emotional distance looks like rejection or instability. But many times, it's part of a much deeper emotional process taking place beneath the surface. Understanding that changes everything. Instead of reacting with fear, you respond with patience and awareness. Rather than chasing reassurance or pulling away defensively, you create an environment where pressure fades and understanding grows. In that kind of space, something remarkable can happen. The person who stepped back may eventually feel safe enough to move closer again, not because they were pressured, but because the emotions that once overwhelmed them no longer feel impossible to face. Most people never reach this point because fear makes them react before understanding has a chance to guide them. And by acting too quickly, they often close doors that might have opened with a little more patience and emotional awareness. Once you learn to look beyond surface behavior, you stop assuming that every step backward is the end of the story. I'd reframe the way you see those complicated emotional patterns. Instead of automatically calling them disinterest, you begin recognizing that human emotions are often far more complex than they appear. Most importantly, you stop walking away from connections that may not actually be ending. In the end, everything comes down to one thing: how you handle uncertainty. Not when everything feels easy, but when fear tells you to react before you truly understand what's happening. Those moments often determine whether a relationship falls apart or grows into something stronger. Our minds crave certainty. We want immediate answers. We want reassurance, control, and proof that everything is okay before the connection slips away. But rushing to fix the situation often creates the very outcome we're trying to prevent. When someone is pressured before they're emotionally ready, they usually pull back even further. When fear controls your response instead of understanding, the emotional distance increases. And if you leave too quickly, you may end something that still had room to grow. That's why the healthiest response is often to slow yourself down. Not out of weakness or passivity, but with intention. Instead of trying to control someone else's emotional pace, you focus on managing your own reactions. Because these moments don't just reveal the strength of the relationship, they reveal your emotional strength too. Can you stay grounded when things feel uncertain? Can you resist the urge to overthink every silence or every change in behavior? Can you respond with calm instead of insecurity? This is where real emotional maturity begins. When you choose not to react impulsively, you create something incredibly valuable: emotional safety. For someone who struggles with vulnerability, emotional safety can change everything. It teaches them that needing space doesn't automatically lead to abandonment. It shows them they can experience uncertainty without being punished for it. It reminds them that not every meaningful connection comes with pressure or demands attached. That doesn't mean ignoring your own needs or accepting endless confusion. It simply means recognizing that emotions develop on their own timeline. Trying to force that process usually creates more imbalance instead of less. So rather than chasing, you give emotions room to settle. Rather than disappearing completely, you remain emotionally steady without becoming overwhelming. Instead of assuming the worst, you stay open long enough to let reality reveal itself, instead of letting fear write the story. This balance isn't easy. It requires patience, self-awareness, and the ability to sit with uncertainty without allowing it to control your actions. But that's exactly what separates reactions that damage relationships from responses that give them the chance to grow. When someone experiences space without feeling pressured, something often begins to shift inside them. The fear becomes quieter. The overwhelm starts fading. They no longer feel trapped by emotions they didn't know how to manage. And as that pressure disappears, clarity has room to develop naturally. When that clarity arrives, their actions begin matching what they truly feel. They move closer because they genuinely want to, not because they were chased into making a decision. They become more emotionally open because they finally feel safe enough to lower their guard. That's often the turning point. A relationship that survives this stage rarely stays the same. It becomes more honest, more emotionally aware, and stronger because both people have moved through uncertainty instead of being defeated by it. At the same time, it's important to stay realistic. Not every relationship reaches this point. Not every person finds that clarity. That's why your goal should never be controlling the outcome. Your focus should be on the way you carry yourself through the process. When you respond with awareness instead of panic, you protect your own emotional well-being. You stop making decisions based only on assumptions and begin handling uncertainty with confidence, patience, and balance. That is a skill many people never develop. The ability to stay calm while others panic, to seek understanding instead of jumping to conclusions, to respond thoughtfully instead of reacting emotionally. Because emotional distance isn't always the ending people imagine. Sometimes it's simply the moment that decides whether a fragile connection breaks under pressure or grows into something strong enough to last. Sometimes distance isn't rejection at all. Sometimes it's what happens when feelings become real enough to feel overwhelming. And the way you respond during those uncertain moments can either increase fear or create the sense of safety that allows genuine clarity to emerge. Real emotional strength isn't found in chasing someone, forcing answers, or running away before you get hurt. It's found in patience, awareness, and staying grounded when emotions become complicated. Because not every step backward means the relationship is over. Sometimes it's simply part of the journey that reveals whether something truly meaningful has the strength to become something lasting. Sometimes distance isn't the end of a connection. It's the moment that reveals how real the emotions have become. Respond with patience instead of fear, and you'll see relationships with greater clarity and confidence. Thank you for watching The Raul Effect. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.